Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Today, we will be considering H.R. 4790, the Vocal Rule Regulatory Harmonization Act. From its inception, the Vocal Rule has been a solution in search of a problem, in my opinion. It seeks to address activities that have nothing to do with the financial crisis, and its practical effects have been to undermine financial stability rather than to preserve and protect it. H.R. 4790 streamlines regulatory authority over the Vocal Rule. It offers increased regulatory charity and provides community banks much-needed relief from the rule's burdensome compliance obligation. This legislation exempts community banks from the Vocal Rule if they do not have or have not controlled or not controlled by an entity with $10 billion and more in consolidated assets, or total trading assets and trading liabilities are no more than 5% of the total consolidated assets. Without objection, I'd like to welcome the gentleman from Arkansas, the gentleman French Hill, a fellow Eagle Scout, and a gentleman who's going through the trials and tribulation of having his awesome senior and high school son visit universities, including my university, Jim, Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. He's a good golfer. He's a better student, but a well-rounded man. And most of that comes from his mother, not from his father. And certainly we'd like to welcome from California Ranking Member Waters. Maxine, welcome back. Hope break was good for you. Easter's good for everybody. So without objection, we're going to enter anything into the record that you may have brought. But before we go further, I want to acknowledge the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for any opening statement the gentleman chooses to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our two guests from the Financial Services Committee for being here. It seems like all we do is welcome people from the Financial Services Committee before the Rules Committee, and I wish there was a little bit more diversity in terms of the legislation we were to consider, because it seems that all we do is chip away at the oversight of our financial industries, and I worry that we're going back to the risky old days that led to the financial crisis that we have all lived through and that almost destroyed our economy outright. And I just say one final thing, and that is that I had hoped that that we came back after this break, that we would have taken up the issue of gun safety legislation. I mean, we've had millions of young people all across the country engaged in peaceful protest, demanding that Congress do something, at least debate the issue, and we've done nothing. I thought maybe we could finally deal with DACA and protect the dreamers, and again, we're back, and we're not doing that. Instead, we're back to chipping away at Dodd-Frank. So it's great to see my two friends here, but I'm not terribly enthusiastic about what we're considering here today, but I'm looking forward to your testimony, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Gentleman Yields back his time. Well, we'll see if we can fire up a little bit of activity then, knowing that this is an important part of ensuring the success of our community banks. Communities need not only community banker, they need the bank that they grew up with, that they know the people there and that people know them in the community. It's a very important aspect of, probably, I do admit, a little bit more important to Arkansas and Texas and some of the smaller states, smaller cities. The ability that we have to make sure that many of our farming and ranching and rural communities have not just the community bank that's there, but that they're under a fair process, that they are not burdened by regulatory schemes that really don't ever come to play, but they're still responsible for responding when the bank examiner comes and then try and explain away either applying it or what their answer is to these things. So I'm very fired up about you being here, French, and delighted that you're here. Gentleman's recognized.
Well, I thank the chairman and for his kind comments about my young 18-year-old son and his future. Thank you for that. And I thank the Vice Chairman McGovern for his comments. And first, let me say, since this is the First time I've been before the committee since we lost Mrs. Slaughter. Again, to the committee, offer my condolences for a great member of Congress and someone who served this House nobly and well all her years. And I know how important she was to each of you in friendship and what a remarkable contributor she was to the Rules Committee. So again, my condolences to the committee and her friends here in our House. In 2008, 2009, I was a community banker long before I chose to run for Congress. So I lived through the financial crisis as a community banker in our country. And so I'm always interested to try to, as we work on things on a bipartisan basis, to amend Dodd-Frank passed some 8 years ago, that I try to put that in perspective from my own personal experience. This evening, we're talking about H.R. 4790, called the Volcker Rule Regulatory Harmonization Act. I'm proud to sponsor this legislation and to have worked for several months with my friend Dr. Foster on what has become a bipartisan and important bill. With his help, it passed the Financial Services Committee 50-10. Really few provisions, when we think back about Dodd-Frank, have been talked about more than what was Section 619, now referred to frequently as the Volcker Rule. Community and Wall Street bankers have talked about the impact of the Volcker Rule and its complexity, how the structure of this rule has curtailed market-making activities in our capital markets that are critical for reducing costs on investors as well as home buyers and credit card users. Banks play an important role in our financial markets by buying and selling securities on behalf of their customers, a process known as market making. Market making is crucial because it provides liquidity for stocks, bonds, notes, commercial paper, which companies rely on when they raise capital or when they securitize important things like mortgages or credit card receivables. It operates by relying on market makers, i.e. our banks, to serve as intermediaries willing to take either side of a trade. And by doing so, these market makers add liquidity to our capital markets. They help hold prices down and reduce the cost of and increase the availability of financing for Main Street job creators, while also making it cheaper and easier for consumers to use their credit cards or obtain a home mortgage. Throughout the discussions about the Volcker Rule, it's been made clear that the current Volcker Rule framework is untenable if we do not want to unnecessarily chill this important market-making function. And that message has come from all perspectives, not just bankers who have voiced concern about the burden of implementing the rule while continuing to engage in market making. It's also been voiced by regulators. Dan Tarullo, Mr. Obama's vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, called the rule too complicated. Former Federal Reserve Chair Yellen acknowledged that the implementation of the rule had been complex and that change may be warranted. Tom Curry, formerly the comptroller of the currency for President Obama, testified that the rule desperately needs simplicity and clarity. This bill before us tonight does two principal things to improve the regulatory efficiency of the Volcker Rule and enhance clarity so that banks can better help fuel the economy that work for the American people. First, like the Senate bill, S-2155, H.R. 4790 will exempt from the rule community banks under $10 billion that do not have meaningful trading activity. And Senate Bill 2155 is Senator Crapo's bill that has passed the Senate now, that has a provision substantially similar to this portion of 4790. Such an exemption of those community banks has been called for by the Department of the Treasury and has indicated a substantially identical provision, as I note, in S-2155, which passed the Senate with 67 votes, 2/3 support. Second, this bill tackles the issue of harmonization that so many regulators have identified as a problem. Unfortunately, by relying on input from 5 different regulatory agencies with disparate statutory missions, the current framework of the rule has resulted in confusion and inefficiencies. The current rulemaking framework resulted in a final rule after more than 2 years of work that exceeds 932 pages and 297,000 words. And since it was implemented, at least hundreds of questions are pending before the Interagency Volcker Working Group because it has yet to reach a consensus on how to answer them. So what Dr. Foster and I have proposed here is clarity and certainty and I'd say harmonization is the key word for how to resolve that conflict. Banks deserve the same clarity so that they can go about their business at the lowest possible cost to serve our markets for liquidity and capital market efficiency and for their own compliance programs. Thus, this second part of the bill tackles these harmonization needs by doing a couple of key things. First, consolidates rulemaking for the Volcker Rule with the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, the regulator traditionally charged with administrating the Bank Holding Company Act, which is where Dodd-Frank inserted the Volcker Rule in statute. And secondly, charges the primary federal regulator for a covered entity, like the SEC for a broker-dealer, with the sole examination and enforcement authority for the Volcker Rule. This bill is not a ploy or some kind of big bank giveaway. Simply put, this bill is a common sense, strongly bipartisan bill that's also bicameral in its nature that helps community banks and Main Street investors and consumers that rely on important market-making functions to drive our economy. Thanks for the opportunity to participate with the Rules Committee, and I welcome your questions. I yield back.
Ms. French, thank you very much. We're delighted that you're with us. The gentlewoman from Los Angeles is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Acting Ranking Member McGovern and members of the committee for allowing me to share my views on H.R. 4790, the latest threat to the Volcker Rule, a cornerstone of Wall Street reform enacted in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Leading up to the financial crisis, Wall Street megabanks engaged in, quote, predatory trading, quote, unquote, which is essentially speculative, highly leveraged bets that benefit their bottom line, but use federally insured loans backed by the U.S. taxpayer. These banks gambled on risky subprime mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps, which even the legendary investor Warren Buffett criticized as, quote, financial weapons of mass destruction, quote, unquote. When the housing bubble finally burst, these bets led to massive losses and required the federal government to bail out the banking industry with trillions of taxpayer dollars to stop an economic catastrophe. To protect the American taxpayer and the economy from this sort of risky trading, Congress included the Volcker Rule as part of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. Specifically, the Volcker Rule prohibits taxpayer-backed banks from engaging in risky proprietary trading and from owning hedge funds and private equity funds. As a result, Wall Street megabanks engage in less reckless risk-taking, and our financial system is stronger. Nevertheless, H.R. 4790 contains two very dangerous provisions that would provide a loophole in the Volcker Rule and make it easier for the Trump administration to weaken or repeal it. First, the bill would provide a blanket exemption from the Volcker Rule for 98% of our nation's banks, which have consolidated assets of $10 billion or less, and with less than 5% of those assets in trading assets. Most community banks do not engage in any trading activities and therefore have no compliance requirements under the rule. However, H.R. 4790 would give all community banks the congressional thumbs up to begin speculative trading instead of focusing on the traditional business of banking. It also makes community banks prime targets for hedge fund salesmen. This blanket exemption is opposed by former Fed Chairman and the rule's namesake Paul Volcker, who has said, quote, I know from my long experience in banking and savings and loan regulations that plausibly small loopholes can be gained and exploited with unfortunate consequences, unquote. The exemption is also opposed by the FDIC Chairman, Martin Gruenberg, FDIC Vice Chairman Thomas Honig, and investor advocates. If we truly want to reduce any regulatory burden of community banks that engage in permitted trading activity, we should be looking at other ways to accommodate them, such as by creating a presumption of compliance with the Volcker Rule, which doesn't open up a loophole. Second, H.R. 4790 would repeal the requirement that the Federal Reserve, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that is FDIC, Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the OCC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, that is the CFTC, work together to jointly implement the rule. Instead, the bank would delegate sole rulemaking authority to the Federal Reserve, which could choose to consult or not consult with the other regulators. This would unreasonably cut the FDC out of any future rule changes, even though it is the regulator charged with protecting deposit insurance against the very risky speculative activities the Volcker Rule was designed to prevent. It would also cut the OCC out of rulemaking process, even though it oversees institutions that account for approximately 40% of bank holding company trading revenues. And it would cut out the SEC and the CFTC, even though these agencies have the expertise and jurisdiction over broker-dealers and future traders and their market-making activities. Worse, appointing the Fed as singular regulator would make it easier for the Trump administration to weaken and repeal the Volcker Rule, even though it was expeditiously promulgated in 2 years, and the regulators are now working together to make appropriate changes. While the bill would at least allow the appropriate banking regulators, SEC and CFTC, to enforce the rule, such enforcement authority is meaningless if Volcker Rule is effectively gutted by the Trump administration. So I strongly oppose H.R. 4790, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. And Mr. Chairman and members, you know, you spoke, Mr. Chairman, about the need to support community banks. I want you to know that the community banks have strong support from both sides of the aisle. We get into problems when there are things we could do for the community banks, but they are joined at the hip by the mega banks, and the mega banks won't turn them loose. If the mega banks and those who support the community banks truly want to see more changes with the community banks, there needs to be a separation so that whenever the community banks are seeking some kind of change, we won't be in the position of saying, well, you can't get it unless the big mega banks also included in this, and that's the real problem. When the community banks feel strong enough to separate themselves from the mega banks, I think that both sides of the aisle could do a better job of being of assistance to them. But the mega banks are in control, and they are the advocates oftentimes for what the community banks need, only if they too can avail themselves of the opportunities that we would create for the community banks. And let me just say that when I mentioned to you all of the oversight agencies that are involved and the attempt to eliminate them so that you just have one regulatory agency, you're going to lose the expertise that's needed in order to make the decisions that are so important to the management of our financial services in ways that will protect our consumers. With that, of course, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to defer my time to the gentlewoman from Wyoming. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both my colleagues for being here today. Mr. Hill, my first question is for you. I just want to clarify. It is not, in fact, the case that we're repealing the Volcker Rule. Is that right?
The gentlewoman from Wyoming is right. We are not repealing the Volcker Rule, and the Volcker Rule absolutely fully applies to all mega banks. This rule purely changes and exempts banks under $10 billion, as was approved by the full United States Senate with 67 votes.
Thank you. Could you also just talk a little bit about the notion that somehow we can't have effective oversight unless we have multiple agencies engaged in the same sort of oversight? I think there's an important streamlining that is going on as well with this bill. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes. The functional regulator, like the SEC for a broker-dealer or the CFTC for a commodity broker, or the bank, the OCC for a national bank, or the FDIC for a state non-member bank, still are in full responsibility for enforcing the Volcker Act in the banks that they regulate. All this harmonization provision does is say that as they enforce the rules, that if there's ever the interpretation of the Volcker rule on what it means and how it should be implemented by the regulatory agencies, that it defers to the Federal Reserve, and through the process, through the FFIEC and through other methods. I mean, obviously, the bank regulators and the securities and commodity regulators are in regular concert. And this is, as I say, not repealing the Volcker rule. And it is not taking away the enforcement authority of the individual 5 functional regulators to oversee their charges in the financial system.
Thank you. And I don't have any further questions. I just want to express my strong support for this bill. I think, as Congressman Hill has noted, our community banks have suffered extensively under what was really a misguided one-size-fits-all approach. And with those banks suffering, our communities have also suffered. And so as we move forward and look for ways that we can help to ensure that regulation for community banks is targeted and tailored to make sense for those banks, that will have a huge impact in terms of the availability of credit as well as economic growth and bringing jobs back and investment back to our local communities. So I know all across my state of Wyoming, people welcome that very much and look forward to beginning to move forward on this. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back your time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A good friend from Arkansas mentioned he was a community banker before he came to Congress. I'm tempted to ask what went wrong. Why did you choose to do this?
Gentleman yield.
Certainly.
I called him a bunch.
Well, thank you for doing that.
His young wife is from Dallas, Texas.
Because it means we have somebody here on a critical committee that actually knows what they're doing.
It does.
That has done it professionally, and that's worth pointing out. First, before I say anything else, I want to welcome both our members. They're 2 of the most thoughtful members we have, and it's always good to have you here. I have a couple of quick questions. You mentioned that this legislation passed 50 to 10. Does that mean a majority of Democrats on the committee supported the legislation?
Yes, sir. The committee has 60 members, and so 50 to 10 would say that a majority of the Democrats supported it.
Well, it's very impressive. Second question is, I had my community bankers up here today, who were, by the way, very much in support of your legislation. They were up here for a variety of reasons. But they also made an important point to me, somebody that knows this well. Since we passed Dodd-Frank, are there more community banks or fewer? And is there more concentration in the big banks or less?
Well, we've seen a long-term trend, and it's accelerated since 2010, that there's more concentration of financial assets in the largest financial institutions in the country because we've lost our community banks approximately in that period. You know, you've heard the story of 1 per day. In 1999, when I was fortunate enough with an investor group to start my company in Arkansas, there were about 300 community banks in Arkansas, and I think there are 102 today.
Was the intent of Dodd-Frank to concentrate more wealth in the big banks or to concentrate less?
Well, I think the intent of Dodd-Frank was to put in additional safety and soundness measures to prevent the kind of catastrophic financial collapse that we have in 08 and 09. But as the gentlewoman from Wyoming said, like many things in Washington and in Congress, it was often a one-size-fits-all solution. And in this regard to Volcker, Chairman Volcker, former Chairman Volcker, and several other members said that proprietary trading was not a principal cause in the 08-09 crisis. And as the ranking member said, This bill does exempt community banks under $10 billion, and she noted they don't participate in proprietary trading or private equity type activities, but they were swept up in this rule and were performing all the compliance functions. And while they're not engaged in proprietary trading or private equity businesses, that's very obvious. Many community banks under $10 billion have a broker-dealer operation where they make markets in our local municipal bonds that help build our schools, build our streets and highways, expand our economies in our states. And the way the Volcker Rule has been interpreted by the 5 regulatory agencies, it has hurt their market-making capability in those bond businesses, bread and butter businesses. You say, well, how is that possible? Well, if you're a community bank and you hold municipal bonds over a weekend or for 5 days that you've bought from a customer that you're going to sell in the future, is that proprietary trading, or is that making market in a local security that's perfectly appropriate and perfectly legal under the safety and soundness rules of banking? That's the kind of thing that's created the confusion, I think. And so that's why I think community banks have been right to ask relief from this rule. And as I say, the United States Senate provided that with 67 votes across their floor, and we've had a majority vote in the House Financial Services Committee for that kind of relief.
I would suggest that this actually gets the floor, we'll see something like that again, because I can't believe, Democrat or Republican, you're not hearing the same things from your community bankers across the board. I mean, they're very adamant about this. This is clearly a case where, for whatever reason, I think for the best of reasons, quite frankly, I don't cast any aspersions on our colleagues that supported for this, but this is much more inclusive and aggressive than anybody meant it to be. It just is. I remember going to one of my local community banks, and I happened to get there a little early, and the president, this is like a $140 million bank. This is not a behemoth that threatens the survival of the United States financial system. He took me back to his operations center, and he showed me 14 cubicles lined up, 7 apiece, back to back, and he said, with all due respect, these are the people that don't make me any money, they don't save me any money, they just deal with compliance issues. That's the kind of burden we put on community banks. So I want to thank you for bringing this forward. I want to thank you for doing it in a bipartisan way, where a majority of Democrats on the relevant committee supported it. I hope we move it across the floor expeditiously, and frankly, I hope we go beyond that, as we have maybe the opportunity to do between now and the end of the year. I mean, I think while I like the product that your committee has produced overall, and certainly your chairman, the Choice Act's a good act, I want to make sure we get something done while we can. And the Senate, which, as you noted, incorporates the language in your bill, provide us an opportunity to do that. So if we can make it better, I'm all for that. So all for always going to conference and trying to improve the product of the Senate. But we have an opportunity through your legislation, but also through larger legislation that incorporates yours, to do something broader, and I hope we seize that. With that, I just thank the gentleman for his testimony, thank the gentlelady as always, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much, gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to, speak for very long here. I just want to, again, thank both of our witnesses. I agree more with the ranking member, Ms. Waters, than I do with you. And part of it is because I just see a pattern here of chipping away at every consumer protection that is part of the Dodd-Frank bill that is designed to protect us from another financial crisis, just coming before this committee and being passed by the House. And, Ms. Cheney rightly pointed out, this doesn't totally overturn and repeal the Volcker Rule, but I know that's what the majority wants to do, because that's what you did in the Choice Act. And so, knowing that that's what the goal is, and seeing, I was kind of joking when you came before here saying that, we see a lot of the Financial Service Committee members up here all the time. I wish we didn't see so much of you. No, nothing personal. But the bottom line is because you're coming up here with legislation that I think is jeopardizing, the economy. So I appreciate you being here, and I'm not convinced that this is the right thing to do, and I will vote no, and I Yield back.
Thank you very much, gentleman. Yields back his time. The distinguished gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate what the ranking member had to say about folks being connected at the hip and how much common ground there really is when we start talking about our local community institutions. We've all heard stories like the one that Vice Chairman Cole told about folks stacked up in the compliance office of just a little, what's virtually a mom and pop bank that's invested in my community more than anybody on Wall Street will ever dream of being invested, both financially and emotionally in the community. And so I'm actually grateful you all have been up here so often. We're really talking now about dozens and dozens of bipartisan bills. And to my friend from Massachusetts' point, no, these bills aren't going as far as one group would like to see them go. And maybe some of them are even going further than another group would like to see them go. But we have a choice of just sitting around and fussing with one another or breaking up some of these big bills into individual components. I think the ranking member is absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. There is more that unites us when we get down to Main Street than that unites us when we're talking about Wall Street. And I am grateful that the Financial Services Committee is working in a way that we can have more of these Main Street conversations. And so I thank you both for spending so much of your time up here with us. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Distinguished gentleman from Florida,
Thank
Judge
you, Mr. Chairman.
Hastings. Yes, sir.
Mr. Hill, what type of banking entities will benefit most from your legislation?
Thank you, Judge. I appreciate the question. I think primarily it'll be the smaller banks, under $10 billion, that are just serving traditional Main Street markets across the country that do not have, not only do they not have $10 billion in total banking assets, but they also can have no measurable trading assets, no off-balance sheet activity. They are a simple, straightforward, traditional community bank. What's being granted to them here, Judge, is two things. The fact that they don't have to comply with a rule that really doesn't apply to them, where they make it apply to them. As I used the example with municipal bonds as an example, you could say that's really not even in the purview of Volcker. But when you read rules, and you know how rules and regulatory operations are for all of our private sector entities, if one is applied to you, then you're going to have a file on it, you're going to have somebody responsible for it, you're going to attempt to be second-guessed by it, and it is part of the exam process for banks of that size.
Are there other ways that we could reduce the compliance burden?
Well, and I think the ranking member made a good point, so did Mr. Woodall, which is there was advice from the ranking member and many Democrats in the House Financial Services Committee that we break the Financial Choice Act out into different topics that would be more attractive to more members, and in fact, that's what we've done. This one doesn't meet the ranking member's test, but many have, and we've broken them down into smaller proposals so that they are directly related to compliance burdens in a number of areas. And you've seen those come before this Rules Committee in smaller, some are more bipartisan than others. I'd argue that some 90 have already passed this House, and I believe there's 12 or 13 that passed on the suspension calendar in recent days.
Well, could we have, or can we create a presumption of compliance with the Volcker rule for all the community banks?
Yeah, let me address that because the ranking member raised that in her testimony. The problem with a presumption of compliance in the real world, speaking as a former private sector practitioner, is that no matter what's written down on the piece of paper, the bank will have to go through all the compliance features anyway, because they won't get the presumption of compliance in reality. I know it will say that on paper, but the rule is still the rule, and the rule is still provided. And so you'll have to then demonstrate to your primary regulator that you are in compliance. You were presumed to be in compliance, but you'll get a question in that exam process to unveil how you are in compliance. And so I think the pushback was that wouldn't be as practical as it sounds if it were just you and I.
Let me hear from Ms. Waters as
Yes.
on the matter.
Well, I think what is being said is even though there could be and perhaps should be a assumption that they are in compliance, what we're having is excuses that, well, maybe it won't work. Maybe even if they have this presumption of compliance, they're going to have to do things above and beyond just having, you know, the waiver, so to speak. I don't know where the basis for that comes from. I don't understand why there's an assumption that the presumption would not work.
Gentleman,
Yes,
I'll yield.
I yield.
well, I appreciate that, but it's the practical reality of living in a regulated business that if the rule applies to you, you can presume to have been a good actor on that rule, but you will still be investigated to the letter of the law to make sure that your presumption is in fact true. And therefore, it's really not an exception, which is why I think the Senate that thoroughly debated this provision and passed it 67-0, or not 67-0, 67 favorable votes, thought through that process and decided to grant the $10 billion exemption for community banks. And we did the same thing and discussed it in markup in our committee and voted 50-10 in the House Financial Services Committee to take that approach. And I really worked on this issue with Dr. Foster for some extended period of time.
All right.
And I appreciate the gentleman's question.
The, Ms. Waters raised the question of the loss of expertise by virtue of the change that you are offering. And the rulemaking responsibilities now are in the hands of 5 agencies. And it's just, something just kind of rubs me in a sort of a negative way when the Fed is already involved, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is involved, the Office of Controller of Currency, the Securities Exchange Commission, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. So what this will do then is put it all in the hands of the Federal Reserve Committee. I'd like you to respond then, Mr. Hill, to Ms. Waters' concern in that regard. How is it that all of this enormous expertise in these other agencies is going to be subsumed inside the Federal Reserve, which I'm fond of saying that the world is controlled by the Federal Reserve and some obscure banker in Switzerland. But just respond to Ms. Waters on the matter.
Well, thank you, Judge. And I, with all due respect to my good friend from California, the ranking member, who I have great respect for and enjoy serving with, I think she, in my view, overstated that aspect. And let me explain what I mean by that. The 5 regulators will still oversee their individual banks or broker-dealers or commodity broker-dealers that they're responsible for, and enforce the Volcker Act as written on their institutions, those over $10 billion. This rule took 2 years to write. It's been in place about 6 years. It's created a lot of confusion, as noted by Powell, Yellen, Curry, and so part of that has been different interpretations of how Volcker should apply in different practical circumstances, in different business conditions. So we have proposed harmonization of that rule interpretation. The Fed will still consult with these other 4 agencies actively in 2 ways. One, by virtue that that's just the practical way to run a regulatory business, but secondly, through the FFIEC, the Federal Financial Exams Council, that's where these kinds of things are handled. But from listening to market participants who have dealt with this for 6 years, listening to the regulators and their testimony to us, this bill just tips the hand on resolving disputes about the interpretation of the rule to the Fed. It's not, you could argue perhaps the Fed's the first among equals here, but they are consulting with those other agencies, and those other agencies are absolutely enforcing the rule over their institutions they're responsible for.
Ms. Waters?
If I may, the feds could choose to consult or not consult. They would not have to do that. There's nothing in this bill that would say they would have to consult. And so that would be a decision that could be made that would not allow for consultation. I worry about the FDIC being out of any future rule changes because it is the regulator charged with protecting deposit insurance against very risky and speculative activities. And so I'm very concerned about all of them being cut out of this, but particularly FDIC. And again, there's no enforcement of consultation at all.
Well, I appreciate both of you, and obviously you both know your subject extremely well and have the mastery of it. And my final comments are not directed to you, but more to this committee's function and picking up on where the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, left off. Like all of you, I did district work at home, and with all due respect, I didn't have, as a matter of fact, I did talk with credit union people. I didn't talk with any community bank people, but that was because I was invited to make a speech at this particular credit union. But I talked with dreamers over the 2-week break. I talked with Haitians who are concerned about temporary protective status. I talked with farmers. I represent a large farm area out in the Glades. And I talk with people about our infrastructure with reference to transportation at home, with new things that are taking place. And then I went to 3 events dealing with gun violence. I didn't have nobody ask me nothing about the vocal rule and financial services matters. And I recognize that they are particularly critically important. But at this point in time, we're going to have to address some of these other subjects, in my view, Mr. Chairman. Otherwise, weakening Dodd-Frank is perhaps critical for some, but I don't think it's any more critical than the important issues that my constituents raise with me and with you. And somewhere along the line, I'm hopeful that we will get around particularly to the gun violence matter rather than just putting it off. We need to have a debate about that. And now we're sitting up here talking about the vocal rule, and we don't know whether or not we're getting ready to be involved further in war. Somewhere along the line, we need to be having some serious conversation about the authorization of the use of military force. And I've sat through many of these skirmishes that people wind up getting killed and uprooted. And presidents, Democrat and Republican, have used authority and not consulted with Congress. And I was sitting here just then thinking, I wonder who in the House of Representatives is the president going to talk to about whatever action he undertakes with reference to Syria. And I believe that there should be a response and a strategy. But to have a strategy that does not include the Congress, to my way of thinking, it leaves us in a hell of a position. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for the time, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Gentleman
may,
yields back his time. Yes, ma'am.
let me just say that there has been several references here to how often we hear in the Rules Committee, and my understanding is we take up 50% of all of the business here in the Rules Committee, and I do think that most of it is designed to undo Dodd-Frank, and it works a hardship on my staff to deal with these issues in the way that they're being dealt with, and most of them will not pass the Senate. And so we engage because we have to, that's our job, but I want you to know I appreciate being treated very nicely here when I come, but I wish I didn't have to come so much. I do believe that. I'm very appreciative for the fact that the Rules Committee really does understand the complication of many of these bills that we bring before you, but I want you to know our members just don't have time to really learn a lot about what's going on, and they certainly don't know anything about Volcker and what it means, and whether or not those banks under 10 billion don't have any compliance responsibilities. But we're opening up the opportunity for community banks to get involved in speculative trading. And I want to tell you, when I came to the Congress of the United States, I was kind of thrown on the old banking committee because everybody was fleeing it because of what had happened with that banking committee and the fact that the SNLs had gone outside of their mission and started to speculate in all kinds of investments and shopping centers and all kinds of things. And I want to tell you, a lot of people got hurt. And I and my staff worked very, very hard to avoid the problems and the failures of the past. And so we're not here because we don't want community banks to thrive, or we're not concerned about what they would consider overregulation. And I'll say it again. The community banks enjoy support from both sides of the aisle, and I wish that there could be more cooperation to focus on the community banks, leave the mega banks out of it, and allow us to get at everything that we think can be done to strengthen those community banks. And so with that, I just, a word of caution, and a word of caution in my caucus about undoing Dodd-Frank that was organized, worked on, and produced, signed into law because of what we had gone through. Don't forget, we had a recession, almost a depression, because of the fact that the big banks and Wall Street have too much power in this institution, and they've had too much power for years in this institution. And so they're not willing to give it up, and I just want us to be careful. And I want members not to get caught in a position when we get into trouble, if we move into areas where we, again, enhancing the power of the mega banks and get caught up in being blamed for, again, another recession or almost depression. With that, enough said. I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you. I don't know if I gave you any time, but you took the time, and I appreciate, this is part of, Maxine, not only the relationship that you have with this committee, but that you also have with me. You made a mistake and moved your office over next to mine. We're with each other on a regular basis, to back and forth to the elevator. You and I have found a great way to not only communicate with each other, but to allow you the time always that you need to make sure you're given plenty of time to do this activity. I do hear you say now you've had too much fun. You'd like to slow down the amount of time that you're over here. The problem is that the chairman, the young chairman of the committee, Jeb Henschling, is a very dear friend of mine. And he is an extremely persuasive young man and has done a very good job to make sure that his activities are brought before the committee. Chairman Henschling is a very influential guy. He has a large committee. He has great members. French Hill, Eagle Scout, Jeb Henschling, Eagle Scout, Pete Sessions, Eagle Scout. We tend to see these things in scouting ways too. But Chairman Henschling has asked that we consume the time. And that's what we're doing, and he's a very powerful force, and that's why we're here doing this. Mr. Byrne? No question. Gentleman does not seek time. The gentleman from the state of Washington? No question. The gentleman from Freedom, Colorado? No question. Does not seek time. I want to thank both of you. As a matter of fact, I did have time during the break to hear from an organization is called IBAT, Independent Bankers Association of Texas. Gentleman Steve Skurlock, who is a friend of mine, but who has over the period of time that I've been a member, talked to me, as well as bankers, Independent Bankers Association of Texas have talked to me about their business, their models, their opportunity to serve people. Dallas, Texas is a growing marketplace. Banks are not on every corner, but banks are important to the success of communities. And I do find that the Boca rule has been a point of discussion. I think the gentleman, Mr. Hill, has talked about his association as a professional in the marketplace about some things that take place. And I too heard the presumption that you spoke about. And all I can tell you is rather than worried about a presumption that you still have to take the test or prepare for, we just ought to go in and make sure they understand. I think we've tried to do this in the past, perhaps through completely doing some other things through the Choice Act, to zero in on specific items which we believe would bring accountability and better the marketplace. And I want to thank both of you for taking time not only to come make your case today, but perhaps more importantly, I think the gentlewoman has highlighted how important community banks are to the success of the marketplace, even though they don't dominate with dollar amounts. Their participation in the marketplace brings so much robust opportunity. So I want to thank both of you. French, if you'll talk to your son to go on Southwestern, it'll help me out. I've got to recruit one more person to go to school there. If not, I'll call the house tonight and see if I can make any progress. I suspect I'll probably have to do that.
My best wishes on that.
Yeah, good luck, huh?
Thank
Thank you
you, Mr.
very
Chairman.
much. If you'll please remember up front at the very beginning, you agree that you'd leave anything in writing for our awesome stenographer, allowing her the opportunity to complete the record of today's transcript. Thank you very much. Is there any other member that would seek to give testimony today to the Rules Committee to H.R. 4790? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion of H.R. 4790, Voca Rule Regulatory Harmonization Act. Chairman, now be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 4790, the Volcker Rule Regulatory Harmonization Act, closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-67 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides that it shall be in order at any time on the legislative day of April 12, 2018, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules as through under Clause 1 of Rule 15 relating to the joint resolution proposing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The rule provides the debate on such a motion shall be extended for 4 hours. Finally, the rule provides the chair may postpone further consideration of such motion to a time designated by the Speaker.
Thank you very much. The distinguished gentleman has now brought forth a motion. I'd like to defer to myself just for a moment. It's one rule, one bill, and one motion to recommit, 1 hour debate. Provides 4 hours of debate time for H.J. Res. 2, which is the balanced budget amendment. And I thank the gentleman. Is there any motion or amendment to that? Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee strike Section 2 from the rule, which grants extended debate time for H.J. Res. 2, proposing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And if I could be heard for just a minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chair, I want to remind my friends on the Rules Committee that there were no hearings on this balanced budget amendment proposal or its potential impacts on the social safety net. There was no markup. This provision was not even an agenda item for today's meeting, and we've heard from no witnesses on this topic. Democrats and Republicans alike have been blocked from offering amendments, and you have even taken away our opportunity to offer a motion to recommit. And I would just say to my friends that if you're going to go through this charade and hold this, what I believe is a hypocritical vote, at least follow some semblance of regular order. Treat amending the Constitution of the United States for only the 28th time in our nation's history with the seriousness that it deserves. This closed process only exacerbates the deep flaws with the balanced budget amendment. The balanced budget amendment is likely to lead to massive cuts in the social safety net, including Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. In the past, Democrats have tried to blunt these negative consequences by offering substitute amendments to protect programs like these. We believe that Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are important programs and deserve to be protected. But this closed process has prevented any such alternatives from being offered. Millions of Americans rely on the safety net for their health and their financial security. They deserve better than this closed Republican process, and I would urge my colleagues to support my amendment.
Thank you very much. Further debate?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
In support of the motion that Mr. McGovern is making, I ask of you, in light of the fact that there aren't any committee documents to pull from, would you tell me how much funding this amendment is going to cut from Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security if it were to be enacted?
The gentleman has seen these attempts from time to time that would put into place a debate across the country. This debate that would take place across the country, including 2/3 of the states that would then need to join in this activity. I'm sorry, first the United States Senate. It is really a debate. It's a debate of ideas about this, what I consider to be an important direction that this country needs to head. Now, as you and I know, there are debates, some that agree, some that disagree, some that think how we should go about a balanced budget. This is the proposal, and it's a competing ideas. And as the gentleman knows, it's these ideas that this amendment would represent as a constitutional amendment. So right now, I can tell you what we can go through that, about what I think a balanced budget amendment would be. But I don't know that there is the assumption or presumption of anything, but rather a debate that would be necessary to support the direction the country's going.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I perceive it as an election year gimmick. It's just that simple to me. And I talk a lot about process in this committee. And quite frankly, you've broken the record for closed rules. You've cut hundreds of elected representatives out of the legislative process. And I continue to say that here and on the floor when I manage any particular rule. And now you're extending this terrible practice to something as important as a constitutional amendment. Quite frankly, that's stunning to some of us, and certainly to me. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to fiscal discipline, the Republican Party, in my view, doesn't have any credibility anymore. You just got through passing a big old tax cut for, in the final analysis, mostly wealthy people. And on the paper, reading the paper on the bumpy ride here today, I came across an article where CBO just made a pronouncement that we would have a $1 trillion deficit in 1919. Now, that borders on some serious cutting going on in a lot of programs. And here we have, all we have to do is just look around our nation. My good friend Mr. Cole's teachers are on strike on their second week. And I didn't know very much about Oklahoma's educational program. I consider the University of Oklahoma to be one of the premier universities in this country. But as pertains to public schools, if you listen to some of these teachers, they're using textbooks. It reminds me of segregation so much. Me having hand-me-down textbooks. These kids don't even have hand-me-down textbooks. They're operating, some teachers say, with textbooks that haven't been changed in 10 years, and some that don't even have the more recent presidents that have been elected. That's ridiculous for a nation with as much talent and resources as we have to be in.
Well, gentlemen, you're from the, I mean, missing the most recent one is really no great loss.
I hear you. Well, let me come to Colorado for you for a minute. because you all have your issues ongoing out there as well. You know, I pay attention to a lot of things, particularly to the members on this committee's constituencies, so that I can raise issues for them. Look, man, just think how long it's been since we had a constitutional amendment. And then go beyond that and think about what the framers did and how long it took them and the debate that they had in the Congress establishing the amendments. We all know that this isn't going anywhere, but it's a nice messaging piece. But I rather suspect that we would be better served with less time being said here by Congress people rather than more time. So I'm with Mr. McGovern. Cut the time on this mess. You didn't have no hearings. You didn't have no markup. And now you're going to tell me that we're going to put to the American public something as critical as a balanced budget amendment. And I might add, the easier way for us to have done it would have been to balance the damn budget. And yet we're going to go around and going to have a balanced budget amendment. We don't need an amendment to do it. What we need is the nerve to face the issues that we are confronted with in this nation and to speak responsibly to people in that regard. I yield back my time, Mr.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Colorado.
Well, it's really unfortunate that we're considering a balanced budget amendment that is not a version that is likely to get two-thirds on the House floor, because I think we need to require a balanced budget in our Constitution. I didn't have that opinion when I first came to Congress. I was naive enough to think that Democrats or maybe Republicans in Congress could balance the budget. I'm no longer that naive. I've seen Republicans spending money hand over fist, inflating the deficit to over $1 trillion. Democrats also had a deficit when they controlled this body. And there are bipartisan balanced budget amendments. I sponsor one. There are others. I think a sincere effort to get to two-thirds could potentially produce a product that would be worthy of our Constitution, that would keep us in good stead and prevent us from mortgaging our future. Instead, there's a product that is designed for political purposes. It's designed to get Democrats to vote no by, of course, putting revenues and expenditures not on a level playing field, by requiring different majorities for each. So, you know, that's fine when I understand a majority has the prerogative to pass bills, and when a bill only needs a majority to pass, you don't need Democrats and you can proceed. But if it was a sincere effort to amend the Constitution to require a balanced budget, there should be discussions with Democrats. I mean, there's certainly been no discussions with me, and I'm a sponsor of a balanced budget amendment. I know there are many other Democrats who could probably get this body to two-thirds if we had a balanced budget amendment that made sense, similar to what my own home state of Colorado has. Many other states have balanced budget amendments that require that. And this is not at all that sincere effort. It is instead a partisan bill with poison pills that make it difficult for any Democrat to vote for. I certainly won't be. I don't know if any Democrats will. Maybe a couple will. I have no idea. Maybe none. But certainly not two-thirds of this body. And I think Republicans are just using it as thinking that this somehow shields them against the spending bill that they just voted for that caused the deficit in the first place, when it doesn't. I mean, the American people are a lot smarter than that. They see through that. So, again, I would hope that we can have a discussion about how to improve our Constitution and require Congress to balance a budget. But we all know this bill isn't it. This bill will not get two-thirds, nor is it good policy, because it does put expenditures and taxes with a different threshold, different rules. And, you know, for that reason, of course, I'm going to be opposing it. And I'm sorry that we can't have a real discussion about actually requiring a balanced budget and passing a balanced budget amendment with two-thirds, getting it onto the states, and getting it done, rather than just using it as cover for passing the very spending bill and budget deal that have directly caused the $1 trillion budget deficit that we face next year. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is there anybody else that would seek time on this matter? See none. As I recall, you have a motion that is on the floor.
I do.
The McGovern amendment.
Yeah.
Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it.
Ask for a
Noes
roll
have it.
call, Mr.
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No, but I would ask if the clerk.
Mr. Chairman, no.
I am no. If the clerk could please ask if how Mr. Collins is recorded.
Mr. Collins of Georgia is not recorded. I'm not being recorded, no. Mr. Collins, no.
Is there any other member that would seek to be recorded that is not recorded at the time? If none, the clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, the ayes
As
have
for
it.
roll call, Mr. Chairman?
Ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Aye. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and accordingly, the gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, Mr. Buck, will be handling this,
And I will be handling for the Democrats.
and Mr. McGovern will be handling this for Democrats. Judge, you normally have a question about this time. At this time, this is our last scheduled meeting for the week. I want to thank each of you and the staff for the coming week that we are having, and to look forward to good news about the Rules Committee this week that may be coming, and I expect it will be on the new ranking member for the committee, and any changes that might be made to that, with the knowledge that we understand the circumstances, and thank the committee for coming in today, and thank you very much. We've now completed our work for the week.